Titus 1 is a great example how the ideal for a church ought to be a plurality of elders. A little bit of context to the passage. Titus is in Crete. It's a new church. It's relatively new believers. They don't have pastors. And Paul urges Titus in verse 5 to appoint elders in every town. We learn from this that churches are not organized on their own. It takes leadership. It takes men to put this leadership together. And that's exactly what Titus was told to do by the apostle. The word elders there in verse 5 is the word presbyteros, from which we get the word Presbyterian. It refers to an aged man, or by extension, it refers to someone who has wisdom. And so an elder may be a younger man, but he ought to have a kind of aged wisdom. But then what Paul does is 2 verses later in verse 7, he switches the terminology from elder to episkopos, or bishop, or overseer. And then we can see in Ephesians 4:11 where he refers to a shepherd or to a pastor. And what we can learn from these three terms coming together is that they're interchangeable. You have an elder, you have a pastor, you have a bishop, all of them speaking about different facets of the office, but the same office. And the idea is not that this authority is placed into one single man, but as we go through scriptures, we often find a plurality of these elders. We find this in Acts 14, for example, where Paul is appointing elders, and again in Acts 20, where he is calling for the elders of Ephesus to meet with him. So again, it's a plurality. These men are not figureheads. They're not there just to stand up front, perhaps do some preaching without any other authority. In fact, when we come to 1 Peter 5, we find that Peter says to exercise authority over the congregation. And then we find the author of Hebrews in Hebrews 13 urging the congregation to submit themselves to the leadership of the church. Now, there has been some discussion about how the authority of the eldership, of the leaders of the church, interacts with the authority that the congregation has. And we do see that the congregation does have a level of authority as well. So for example, we find in 1 Corinthians 5 that the congregation has a part in excommunicating an erring member. And then we go back to Matthew 18:17, and we can see the congregation having a part in church discipline. So while the elders of the church would have the leadership, perhaps we could say it's elder-led, congregationally affirmed. And we can see from all of this that there are many practical, spiritual, theological benefits to this. So you might have a church, let's say with Pastor Baloy, and he is being gossiped about or slandered by people in the congregation, and he's reluctant to defend himself. If there is a plurality of elders, the other elders can come through and put out that particular fire. Especially in Africa, where many times the congregation may not have the means to support a pastor full-time, which means the pastor, elder, bishop will work another job. I think at all times, the congregation ought to at least have it their goal to be able to support one pastor, especially if he is faithful in preaching the word. And we would take that from 1 Timothy chapter 5. Another practical example of a plurality of elders would be if one pastor, for example, is moving away from orthodoxy, the other elders of the church are able to come in and correct him. Whereas if it was just a single pastor, perhaps the congregation would not have the courage or the wherewithal or the maturity to rebuke that one pastor. And then, of course, there's benefits such as one church that has 5 elders, let's say, and a new church plant across town that is just starting up. They're able to provide that smaller, younger church with one of their elders and still move on effectively. So when we ask the question, who should lead the congregation? It ought to be a plurality of elders because of Titus chapter 1, verse 5, because of Acts 14, Acts 20, and then also because of all the theological, spiritual, and practical benefits of a plurality of elders.